Let's start with the reality of those words. Hang on, there we go. So we read this part as an exercise in intellectual honesty. Last week, we also read Deuteronomy chapter 28, and we read the first 14 verses. And the first 14 verses are the blessings, the stuff that's going to have all the good things that are going to happen to Israel if they obey the law. And then after those 14 verses, there are 54 verses of curses. These were just like a selection, just a part of the 54 verses of all of the horrible things that are going to happen to Israel if they don't obey the law. So what's going on here? The historical reality is that all of these things listed in these 54 verses actually happened to Israel. So the people of Israel were living in the land, and suddenly the Babylonians, well, first the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans showed up, and their armies overran the people of Israel, and they shipped them off here, and they shipped them off there, and some of them disappeared, and some of them got to come back, but they were persecuted and abused and enslaved and all sorts of horrible, horrible things. So Deuteronomy is probably written sometime after the Babylonians. And the people of Israel had to figure out, how does this happen to us? How does this keep happening to us that we, the special people of God, keep getting run over by everybody and their dog, it seems, throughout our history? How can we possibly make sense of this? These are people who worship, or how can we possibly make sense of this? And rather than change their idea of God, which was an option, right? The people of Israel wrote stuff like Deuteronomy and said, no, this idea of God, we're going to stick with it, and we're going to understand these current actions as punishment for not obeying. Because, right, one of their central ideas about God was that God was the God of power and might. And let's face it, if a God can't protect you from your enemies, what good are they anyway? So, right, that's what they did. Now, before we go on from this and say, oh, those silly Israelites, why did they do that? We need to understand and recognize how much that is still part of the way we think about ourselves today, right? That so often in American popular culture, the size of the American army and its victory is considered to be part of a sign that God, in fact, is on our side, right? So that ancient idea of who God is and what God is for is still very much part of American pop culture, right? If God can't protect you, then what is God for after all, right? And so the fact that we happen to use weapons to do this is just the means by which God works, right? And so we regularly hear our leaders invoke God bless America, which, as far as I can tell, basically means increased military spending, and away we go, because that's the sign. That's the sign that we are on God's side and God is on our side. It's also true in a certain popular reading of history that I've heard many times throughout my life, that the reason that the Roman Empire fell and the reason that the British Empire fell is because of moral laxity. Right? The idea is that the people, they used to be good people, they used to be God-following sorts of people, and then they started to do all of these morally inappropriate things, right? And then they lost their empire. So this idea that, and we, therefore, as Americans, have to maintain certain moral standards, or else God is going to come and punish us, just like it says in Deuteronomy. Now, I'm guessing that most of us here and online don't believe this. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do for a paradigm for who God is and how God acts? And right, one option is always just to sort of toss out the book and say, well, we're just not going to read this thing, but we're still here in a Christian church, and I think there's a lot to be said for the book personally. So let's find an alternative paradigm here. Because the assumption in this paradigm is that, right, so my sermon is called Responding to the Word. And this paradigm assumes that the Word of God, and the way to respond to it, that the Word of God is mostly rules. Right? There's a number of cartoons going around on the internet, right? And they're, they change a little bit. But the punchline is fairly consistently, if I had wanted rules, I'd have gone to church. Right? The idea that basically that's what we do here at church is we figure out what the rules are, and then my job is to make sure that you all obey them. And the assumption, of course, is that the difference between conservatives and liberals is that conservatives are people who follow the rules and liberals are people who don't. Right? That's how you can tell, right? And again, in American pop culture, the shorthand for all of this is the fact that when we want to display our religiosity, our righteousness, right, the thing we display is the 10 Commandments. That's the thing that gets put out, because ultimately in this paradigm, it's about the rules. But it's just not true. If you actually look at the Bible, right, you'd notice that most of the Bible is not law, not even the Old Testament, which is often called the law, right? The law part of the Bible, law and grace, for those of you who come from Lutheran backgrounds, right? 2/3 of the Old Testament is actually poetry, right? All of Psalms, Proverbs, all of the prophets, poetry, right? It's not a bunch of rules. And even the law part, right, or even the other bits of the Old Testament is mostly stories. In fact, even the law itself, right, the first 5 books of the Old Testament are called the law, and the law is about half stories rather than legal text. Or think about the parts of the Bible that people actually know. Right? Probably the most known part of the Bible is Psalm 23, which is a poem. And there's guides me in the paths of righteousness, which I suppose could be about the law, but doesn't have to be. So we there is this paradigm that says, yes, there's the 10 Commandments, but the Christian response could be, well, yeah, but why don't we post the Beatitudes instead? Because the Beatitudes are not competing rules. They're not rules at all. They're not like thou shalt be or thou shalt not be. It's like, blessed are. It's a very different way of thinking about God and how we respond to God. The other way to think about this is to use the Gospel of John. So we read this bit out of Gospel of John, and the Gospel of John, the Word of God is Jesus. The person of Jesus. Jesus is the Word of God. The Word, right? So the rules are not the point. Jesus is the point. And so, right? So when Jesus comes, right, and talks to Mary and Martha, right, it's Martha who says, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. She doesn't say, if Lazarus had obeyed all of the laws, he would not have died, which is the legal paradigm. But in the Gospel of John, it's the presence of Jesus that makes the difference. Right? And in case you're wondering if I'm making sort of too much of a metaphor out of this story, the reality is that in John, everything is story and everything is metaphor at the same time. And there's always at least one, if not 2 metaphors going on. So yeah, I'm within the rules for at least John here. Right, and it's the presence of Jesus, but it's not personal relationship. right? So again, if that's the phrase that's running through your head here, that's not what's going on in John, because in John, the relationship is always communal, and it's always inside of a group. The reward that Jesus offers life is not individual, it's community. It's what we're trying to do here on a Sunday morning and the rest of the week. And finally, one more thing. The whole law paradigm is problematic at best because it simply ignores women. Right? The law, that whole realm of the law in the Bible and in popular American religion is men's territory. They're the ones who make the law. They're the ones who enforce the law. They're the ones who make sure, right, who tell people what the law is, right? And so that paradigm simply ignores women's culture. It ignores women's reality. It ignores women's worship. It ignores, right, that whole realm. And that whole realm isn't a major part of our Bible, unfortunately. So we often get stuck reading between the lines, trying to figure out sort of in between the lines and in the margins what's going on for the 52%, right, of any society that is female, and probably much higher in ancient worlds. Which is why we're using the Women's Lectionary this year to try to read between those lines and find those. So responding to the word is a tricky thing. It's not straightforward, and it's certainly not trying to figure out what the rules are and trying to make sure we obey them. There's still something to be said for not doing any evil. I mean, that's usually a good plan, but it's not the whole plan. It's not the plan we're aiming for. Amen. So, right, again, not a lot of songs specifically about women's culture and women's realities in, well, anywhere. But there is one in 546 in our hymnal, and it's one we don't know. So if you have a choice between reading the words and singing the music, I invite you to read the words, but we'll try to sing the music too.